He has survived corrupt popes, immoral bishops, weak priests, heretics, schisms, persecutions, revolutions, and empires that believed they could erase the name of Christ from history. Every single one of those powers rose for a moment, appeared invincible, and then disappeared into dust while the church remained standing. That is not an accident of history. That is providence. That is Christ keeping his promise that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. But surviving is not the same as remaining faithful as an individual soul. Entire generations can lose the faith while the church herself remains indefectible. Entire nations can become spiritually barren while the sacraments remain valid. And that is why this moment matters so much, because you are not responsible for saving the institutional church. Christ will do that. But you are responsible for your own soul, for your family, for whether you stand in the truth or drift quietly into confusion while convincing yourself everything is fine. One of the greatest lies of modern Catholicism is the idea that holiness is unrealistic. People speak about sainthood as though it belongs to another age, another world, another type of human being. They look at the saints and say, well, that was different. The modern world is too complicated. No, the modern world is not too complicated for grace. The saints faced pagan Rome, torture, political collapse, corruption in the clergy, wars, plagues, and spiritual darkness that would terrify most modern believers. What made them saints was not convenience. It was clarity. They knew who God was, they knew what truth was, and they were willing to suffer rather than compromise it. That same call is being placed before you right now. You must understand that neutrality does not exist anymore. We have entered a period where passive Catholicism is collapsing. Cultural Catholicism cannot survive what is coming because cultural Catholicism was built on social support structures that no longer exist. There was a time when the culture itself reinforced parts of Christian morality. Even imperfectly, society still recognized marriage, sacrifice, modesty, discipline, and objective truth. That framework has dissolved. And when the surrounding culture no longer carries even fragments of Christian order, superficial believers begin drifting almost immediately because nothing inside them was ever deeply rooted. This is why so many young Catholics leave the faith the moment they leave home. They were never formed. They inherited habits without conviction. They inherited sentiment without doctrine. And sentiment collapses under pressure. This is why parents must stop outsourcing spiritual formation. Your children cannot receive their deepest understanding of reality from social media, entertainment culture, and secular institutions while you hope that 1 hour of religious education each week will somehow balance the scale. It will not. The modern world catechizes constantly. Every screen preaches. Every algorithm forms desire. Every cultural narrative teaches a theology, even when it pretends to be neutral. If you are not actively forming your children in truth, someone else is actively forming them in error. There is no emphasis. There is no neutral territory. Souls are always being shaped towards something. And let me say something directly to fathers because this crisis has exposed a terrible wound inside Catholic families. Many fathers have abdicated spiritual leadership entirely. They work, they provide financially, they come home exhausted, and they assume that spiritual formation is the mother's responsibility or the priest's responsibility or the school's responsibility. No, the father is called to be the spiritual head of the home, not a tyrant, not a dictator, but a protector and leader. When fathers pray, children notice. When fathers kneel at Mass reverently, children remember. When fathers go to confession regularly, the entire atmosphere of the home changes. Demons understand authority structures better than most modern Catholics do. A father who takes spiritual authority seriously becomes a shield over his family in ways that are invisible but absolutely real. And mothers, never underestimate the power God has entrusted to you. The spiritual sensitivity of mothers is one of the greatest gifts in the order of grace. Throughout the history of the Church, countless saints were formed by praying mothers who refused to surrender their children to darkness. Think of Saint Monica weeping and praying for Augustine while he wandered in error for years. Think of the mothers who secretly taught the faith during communist persecutions. Think of the hidden sacrifices, rosaries, fasting, tears, and acts of love that preserved entire generations of Catholics when institutions failed them. Heaven sees those sacrifices even when the world does not. What we are living through is ultimately a crisis of worship. People become what they worship. If God is no longer worshipped with reverence, awe, sacrifice, and obedience, then something else takes his place. Usually the self. Modern culture has created a civilization obsessed with the self. My truth, my feelings, my identity, my fulfillment, my desires. And the terrifying thing about self-worship is that it rarely feels evil. It feels empowering. That is why it is so dangerous. Satan fell because of self-exaltation. I will not serve. Every ideology that places the autonomous self above God eventually reproduces that rebellion in one form or another. This is why humility is now a revolutionary act. Genuine humility. Not weakness, not passivity, but the willingness to submit oneself to reality as God created it. To say, I am not the center of existence. I do not define truth. I do not redefine morality. I receive reality from God. That posture is becoming increasingly rare because modern society conditions people to view submission itself as oppression. But Christianity begins with surrender. Christ himself in Gethsemane shows us the pattern. Not my will, but yours be done. Every saint learned to live those words. Every soul that refuses them eventually builds its life on illusion. I also need to warn you against another temptation that appears when people begin waking up to the crisis in the church. The temptation toward bitterness. Some Catholics discover the depth of corruption, confusion, and compromise, and they become consumed with anger. They spend all their time reading scandals, attacking clergy, fighting online, drowning themselves in outrage. Listen carefully. Rage can become spiritually intoxicating. The devil does not care whether he destroys your soul through liberalisms or through hatred. Both sever charity. Both destroy peace. Truth without charity becomes brutality. Charity without truth becomes sentimentality. The Catholic soul must hold both together, or it becomes distorted. That means you must pray for priests, even when priests fail you. Pray for bishops, even when bishops confuse you. Pray for the Holy Father, even when you are distressed or troubled by decisions coming from Rome. The Church is not purified through contempt. She is purified through suffering united to Christ. St. Catherine of Siena corrected popes, but she did it while loving the Church with ferocious fidelity. That balance is what Catholics must recover. Fidelity without naivete, clarity without hatred, courage without pride. There are many listening to this right now who feel overwhelmed. You see the confusion in the church, the corruption in culture, the instability in the world, and you wonder whether your small acts of faithfulness even matter. Let me tell you something the saints understood deeply. God works through remnants. He always has. He preserved Noah while the world drowned in corruption. He preserved Israel through exile. He preserved the apostles while empires raged around them. Never underestimate what God can do through a small number of faithful souls who refuse compromise. One holy family can transform an entire neighborhood. One faithful priest can save thousands of souls. One hidden contemplative praying in silence can hold back spiritual darkness in ways the world will never measure. The future of the church will not belong to the comfortable. It will belong to the convicted. The age of casual Christianity is ending. What is emerging now will demand Catholics who know why they believe, who are willing to sacrifice for the faith, who are willing to appear strange in the eyes of the world rather than betray Christ. That may sound frightening, but in another sense, it is deeply liberating because clarity always liberates. Once you stop trying to please the world and God simultaneously, your soul becomes simpler, stronger, more peaceful, and peace is possible even now. That is the extraordinary thing about authentic Catholic life. The saints were often living in periods far darker than ours, and yet they radiated peace because their peace did not come from circumstances. It came from union with God. The Eucharist remained. Confession remained. The Rosary remained. Grace remained. Christ remained. Those realities are still here now. The same sacraments that sanctified saints centuries ago are available to you today. The same Blessed Mother who protected Christians at Lepanto intercedes now. The same Saint Michael who cast Satan from heaven fights now. The same Sacred Heart of Jesus burns with mercy now. Do not waste this warning. That is the final thing I want to leave you with. Do not hear these truths and then return unchanged to distraction, comfort, and spiritual passivity. Because every warning from God carries responsibility. If you know the battle is real, then you must fight. If you know the faith is true, then you must live it seriously. If you know eternity exists, then you must stop treating this life as though it were permanent. The deception operating inside the church is real, but grace is more real. The corruption is serious, but Christ is stronger. The darkness is spreading, but darkness has never once defeated light, not once in all of salvation history, and it will not begin now. The question is not whether God will remain faithful. He will. The question is whether you will. There is something deeply unsettling about realizing that many of the spiritual dangers threatening Catholics today do not look dangerous at all. In fact, most of them appear compassionate, reasonable, modern, and even virtuous on the surface. That is precisely why they are effective. Satan rarely attacks the church through obvious hatred anymore, because obvious hatred creates resistance. Instead, he attacks through confusion. He takes truths, twists them slightly, softens their edges, removes their consequences, and then presents the distortion as a more mature version of Christianity. And because modern Catholics have been formed more by emotional culture than by theology, many cannot detect the difference between authentic mercies and counterfeit compassion. One of the clearest examples of this is the collapse of the sense of sin. Go back 50 or 60 years and Catholics understood something instinctively that many no longer understand now. They understood that sin destroys, not symbolically, not poetically, but actually. Mortal sin severs the soul from sanctifying grace. It separates the person from friendship with God. The saints spoke about this constantly because they loved souls enough to warn them. Today, however, many Catholics speak about sin almost apologetically, as though the very concept itself were embarrassing or psychologically unhealthy. Priests avoid mentioning hell because they fear sounding harsh. Homilies focus almost entirely on self-esteem, social harmony, or vague encouragement, while remaining silent about judgment, repentance, sacrifice, and eternal consequences. But here is the problem. If people no longer understand the gravity of sin, then Christ's sacrifice on Calvary stops making sense. Why would God become man, endure torture, crucifixion, humiliation, and death if sin were merely a minor imperfection? The cross only makes sense when you understand the horror of sin and the infinite love of God willing to redeem humanity from it. Remove the seriousness of sin, and you reduce Christianity to moral inspiration. The church becomes a therapy center, the sacraments become symbolic rituals, and Jesus becomes little more than a life coach with spiritual language attached to him. This is why confession has disappeared from the lives of so many Catholics. In many parishes, confessional lines that once stretched through the church are now nearly empty. Entire generations go years without confession while continuing to receive Holy Communion casually and routinely. St. Paul warned explicitly that receiving the body and blood of Christ unworthily brings judgment upon oneself. The Church has always taught this, and yet modern Catholics are often encouraged to approach communion regardless of their spiritual condition, because denying anyone communion is considered unwelcoming or exclusionary. Think carefully about how inverted this is. The Church once viewed confession as an act of liberation, healing, and preparation for union with Christ. Now, the culture treats confession as oppressive, while encouraging sacrilegious communion in the name of inclusion. And I want to say something difficult here, because it needs to be said clearly. A priest who refuses to preach about mortal sin because he fears making people uncomfortable is not protecting souls. He is abandoning them. Love warns, love corrects, love risks rejection for the sake of truth. Imagine a doctor discovering aggressive cancer in a patient and refusing to mention it because he wants the patient to feel affirmed and peaceful. That would not be compassion, it would be monstrous negligence. Yet spiritually, this happens constantly. Catholics living in objectively gravely sinful situations are reassured rather than corrected. They are comforted rather than called to conversion. And the tragedy is that many priests doing this genuinely believe they are being merciful because they themselves were formed inside theological confusion. The crisis becomes even more severe when you examine what modern culture has done to the understanding of conscience. Properly understood, conscience is not the ability to invent morality for oneself. Conscience is the judgment of reason by which a person recognizes the moral quality of an act according to objective truth. It must be formed, educated, disciplined. But modern Catholicism often presents conscience as though it were an independent authority superior to revelation itself. People now say things like, well, my conscience tells me this is okay, even when the church has definitively taught otherwise for centuries. Do you understand what this means spiritually? It means the individual self has replaced God as the final authority. Once conscience becomes detached from objective truth, morality collapses into personal preference. And when morality becomes preference, repentance disappears because no one believes they are wrong anymore. They simply believe they are different. This is why modern people are often psychologically fragile. Deep down, the human soul knows it was created for truth. It knows it cannot survive indefinitely inside contradiction. The anxiety, confusion, and instability consuming modern society are not unrelated to this rejection of objective moral order. Human beings cannot flourish while denying reality. This confusion is intensified by the modern obsession with feelings as the ultimate measure of authenticity. We now live in a civilization where emotions are treated almost as sacred revelations. If a person feels something strongly enough, society immediately assumes that feeling must define reality itself. But Catholic spirituality has never taught this. The saints consistently warn that feelings are unstable, temporary, and often deceptive. Spiritual maturity does not mean doing whatever feels authentic in the moment. It means disciplining one's desires so they conform to truth and virtue. Think about Christ in Gethsemane. Did he feel comfort? Did he feel emotional peace? No. He sweat blood in agony before the crucifixion. Yet holiness consisted not in following emotion, but in obedience to the Father. Modern spirituality often says, follow your heart. Christianity says, purify your heart. Those are radically different messages. One enthrones emotion, the other transforms it through grace. And this is where spiritual warfare becomes extremely concrete. Demonic deception often operates through disordered emotion because emotions influence perception. If Satan can manipulate fear, lust, pride, resentment, or despair, he clouds the intellect and weakens the will. That is why Catholics must cultivate discipline. Fasting matters. Silence matters. Mortification matters. These practices are not medieval oddities. They train the soul to resist tyranny from within. A person incapable of denying themselves small pleasures becomes extraordinarily vulnerable when confronted with larger temptations. Modern society conditions people to avoid suffering at all costs. Every inconvenience must be eliminated immediately, every discomfort medicated, every silence filled with noise. But Christianity was born from the cross. There is no sanctity without sacrifice. Every saint understood this. The obsession with comfort is spiritually catastrophic because it trains souls to flee the very conditions through which God often sanctifies them. And when suffering inevitably arrives, as it always does, people collapse because they were never taught how to endure it with meaning. This is why the older Catholic traditions of penance, fasting, abstinence, and reverence matter so much. They form resilience, they strengthen the will, they detach the soul from slavery to appetite. The modern world mocks these things because the modern world worships indulgence. But indulgence weakens souls. A civilization built entirely around pleasure eventually becomes incapable of courage because courage requires sacrifice. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the crisis surrounding purity. Modern culture has normalized forms of impurity so pervasive that many Catholics barely recognize them anymore. Pornography alone has devastated millions of souls while remaining almost entirely unaddressed from many pulpits. Entire generations of young men have had their imaginations corrupted before adulthood. Young women are formed inside a culture teaching them to measure their worth through attention and sense of sexual validation. Families are being spiritually poisoned while society calls it freedom. The demonic understands the power of impurity because impurity disorders love itself. It trains the soul to consume rather than to sacrifice. It turns persons into objects. It isolates individuals inside fantasy and addiction. And once a soul becomes enslaved to lust, prayer becomes difficult, discipline weakens, shame increases, and spiritual resistance declines dramatically. This is why the saints spoke so forcefully about chastity, not because sexuality is evil, but because sexuality is sacred and therefore powerful. Everything happening now points toward the same reality. Modern Catholics are being systematically detached from sacrifice, repentance, reverence, discipline, and objective truth. And once those foundations disappear, Christianity itself becomes unrecognizable. What remains is religious language without supernatural substance. But the solution is not despair. It has never been despair. The solution is restoration, not innovation, not endless adaptation to secular culture, restoration of the fullness of Catholic life exactly where it has been abandoned. The saints already gave us the blueprint: frequent confession, reverent liturgy, Eucharistic devotion, daily prayer, fasting, spiritual discipline, fidelity to doctrine, love for truth, devotion to Our Lady. These things built Christian civilization once before. They can rebuild souls again now. And in the next part, I am going to show you how modern Catholics were slowly conditioned to distrust certainty itself, and why that psychological transformation may be one of the most dangerous spiritual developments in the history of the Church. One of the most devastating transformations to occur inside the modern Catholic mind is the growing suspicion towards certainty. Catholics today are often taught, either directly or indirectly, that conviction itself is dangerous. If someone speaks too clearly about doctrine, too firmly about morality, or too confidently about truth, they are quickly labeled rigid, divisive, intolerant, or extreme. Notice what has happened here. The problem is no longer whether something is true or false. The problem is whether someone appears too certain about it. That psychological shift has changed the entire atmosphere of Catholic life. The Church once produced saints, martyrs, missionaries, theologians, and ordinary believers who were willing to die rather than deny even a single article of the faith. Why? Because they believed truth came from God and therefore carried eternal consequences. The martyrs of the early Church did not walk calmly into execution because Christianity felt emotionally meaningful to them. They died because they knew it was true. Objective truth gives birth to courage. Uncertainty produces paralysis. And a church trained to distrust certainty eventually loses the ability to defend anything at all. Modern culture constantly repeats the same message in different forms. Certainty is arrogance. We are told nobody can truly know religious truth with confidence. Doctrine becomes a perspective. Morality becomes a conversation. Scripture becomes open to interpretation. And once everything becomes fluid, authority collapses. But Catholicism was never built upon permanent uncertainty. Christ did not tell the apostles to go into the world and share personal opinions. He commanded them to teach all nations with authority. That authority was not invented by the Church. It was given by God. This is why the attack on doctrine matters so much. Doctrine is not cold abstraction. Doctrine protects reality. Every dogma of the Church exists because something precious was under attack. The divinity of Christ, the Trinity, the Eucharist, the virgin birth, the authority of the Church, the nature of grace. Every doctrine was clarified because error threatened souls. The Church defined truth precisely because love demanded protection. A parent who warns a child about poison is not being narrow-minded. They are preserving life. In the same way, Catholic doctrine guards souls from spiritual destruction. But modern Catholics are increasingly uncomfortable with boundaries because boundaries imply exclusion. And exclusion feels offensive to a culture obsessed with affirmation. Yet Christ himself constantly spoke in terms of separation: sheep and goats, narrow gate and wide road, wheat and chaff, truth and falsehood, heaven and hell. The gospel is filled with divisions because reality itself contains divisions. Good and evil are not interchangeable. Grace and sin are not compatible. Light and darkness do not blend peacefully together. One of the greatest lies promoted today is the idea that clarity itself causes division. No, error causes division. Truth reveals it. When a doctor identifies a disease, he did not create the illness by diagnosing it. He exposed what was already there. Likewise, when the Church defines truth clearly, she is not inventing conflict. She is uncovering it. But modern society has become so emotionally dependent upon social harmony that many Catholics now prefer ambiguity over confrontation, even when eternal truths are at stake. This fear of conflict has produced a generation of clergy terrified of offending anyone. Priests soften doctrine, avoid controversial teachings, and speak in vague therapeutic language because they fear backlash. Bishops issue statements so carefully managed that they often communicate almost nothing clearly at all. The result is spiritual disorientation among the faithful. Catholics hunger for clarity because the human soul naturally longs for truth. But instead of certainty, many receive endless nuance, endless complexity, endless pastoral ambiguity. Now, nuance has a legitimate place in theology. The Church has always recognized complexity in pastoral situations. But nuance without clarity becomes manipulation. It becomes a method for avoiding uncomfortable truths while pretending to uphold them. And ordinary Catholics instinctively sense this contradiction. They hear church leaders say doctrine has not changed while simultaneously behaving as though it no longer matters. That contradiction creates confusion, distrust, and eventually cynicism. And cynicism is spiritually deadly because it corrodes hope. Once Catholics begin believing that truth itself is inaccessible or endlessly negotiable, many stop fighting entirely. They retreat into private spirituality, disconnected from doctrine. Others abandon the faith altogether because they conclude that if the Church herself appears uncertain, then certainty must be impossible. This is one reason why so many young people leave Catholicism after encountering secular ideology at universities. They were never given intellectual foundations strong enough to resist pressure. They inherited emotional religion without philosophical depth. The tragedy is that Catholicism possesses one of the richest intellectual traditions in human history. The Church does not fear reason because truth cannot contradict truth. St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, St. Bonaventure, and countless other Catholic thinkers built an intellectual framework capable of confronting every major philosophical challenge of civilization. But modern catechesis often reduces the faith to emotional encouragement and vague morality. Young Catholics learn almost nothing about natural law, metaphysics, apologetics, church history, or moral theology. Then they enter hostile secular environments completely unprepared. And make no mistake, modern secular ideology is theological in nature even when it claims not to be. Every worldview answers religious questions, whether explicitly or implicitly. What is the human person? What is freedom? What is truth? What gives life meaning? What is salvation? Secular culture offers its own answers to all of these questions. The problem is that many Catholics absorb those answers unconsciously because they were never deeply formed in the Church's answers. This is especially visible in the modern obsession with identity. Contemporary culture teaches people to define themselves primarily through desires, emotions, psychological experiences, or political categories. But Catholicism teaches something radically different. Your deepest identity is not rooted in appetite or feeling. It is rooted in being created in the image of God. Modern identity politics fragments humanity into tribes competing for validation and power. Christianity unites humanity through shared origin, shared fallenness, and shared redemption in Christ. Yet many Catholics now interpret Christianity itself through ideological frameworks borrowed from secular politics. The gospel becomes reduced to activism detached from transcendence. Sin becomes purely structural rather than personal. Salvation becomes social transformation rather than union with God. Of course, Catholics must care about justice, charity, and the dignity of every person. But when Christianity is reduced entirely to political categories, the supernatural disappears. The faith becomes horizontal. The eternal is forgotten. This horizontalization of religion is one of the defining spiritual disasters of the modern age. Everything becomes centered on human experience, while God Himself fades into the background. Liturgies become focused on community affirmation. Homilies revolve around psychology and social themes. Prayer becomes self-expression rather than adoration. Even morality becomes less about holiness and more about social acceptability. The transcendent dimension of Catholicism, the mystery, awe, sacrifice, reverence, and supernatural power is slowly suffocated. And this suffocation creates spiritual starvation. Human beings were created for transcendence. That longing cannot be eliminated. It can only be redirected. When authentic transcendence disappears from religion, people begin seeking substitutes elsewhere. This is why occult practices, New Age spirituality, astrology, witchcraft, manifestation rituals, tarot cards, and pseudo-mystical ideologies are exploding in popularity, especially among young people. They are spiritually hungry, and when the church presents watered-down therapeutic religion instead of supernatural Christianity, many go searching elsewhere. The irony is heartbreaking. The Catholic faith already contains the deepest mystical tradition on earth. The lives of the saints, Eucharistic miracles, contemplative prayer, sacramental grace, angelic realities, spiritual warfare, Marian apparitions approved by the Church. Catholicism is saturated with the supernatural. But because modern Catholicism often fears appearing too mystical or too traditional, many believers are never introduced to the depth of their own inheritance. And so we arrive at a terrible paradox. Catholics starving for mystery abandon the Church in search of spirituality, while standing inside the greatest treasury of spiritual riches ever entrusted to humanity. This is why restoration cannot merely be moral or political. It must be spiritual and intellectual simultaneously. Catholics must recover confidence in truth, confidence in doctrine, confidence in the saints, confidence in the sacraments, confidence in the supernatural reality of the faith itself. Because a church uncertain about her own identity cannot guide a civilization drowning in confusion. And in the next part, I am going to explain why the family has become the primary battlefield of spiritual warfare and how modern culture is systematically targeting the structure God designed to protect souls. What we are witnessing now is not only a crisis of ideas, but a crisis of formation inside the most basic unit of human society, the family. If you want to understand why confusion spreads so quickly in the modern world, you must begin here. The family was never simply a social arrangement. In the Catholic understanding, it is a sacred institution established by God, a domestic church where souls are first introduced to truth, prayer, discipline, and love. When that structure weakens, everything built upon it begins to collapse. The attack on the family rarely appears as an attack. It presents itself as liberation, flexibility, or progress. But its effects are consistent: weakened authority, blurred roles, diminished transmission of faith, and fragmented identity in children. Parents today often feel overwhelmed, not because parenting has become impossible, but because the cultural environment surrounding the family has become spiritually hostile in subtle ways. Children are no longer primarily formed at home and then reinforced by culture. In many cases, they are formed by culture and only lightly corrected at home. This inversion has profound consequences. In a properly ordered Catholic family, parents are the first teachers of faith. The father models authority, discipline, and spiritual leadership. The mother embodies nurturing love, prayerful presence, and moral sensitivity. Together, they create an environment where truth is not merely taught but lived. Children learn not just what to believe, but how to believe. They absorb reverence by watching reverence. They learn prayer by seeing prayer. They understand sacrifice by witnessing sacrifice. But modern culture actively competes with this formation. Through screens, entertainment, education systems, and peer influence, children are immersed in narratives that often contradict Catholic anthropology at its root. The human person is redefined. Morality is relativized, authority is questioned, pleasure is elevated as the highest good. And because this formation is constant, emotional, and visually powerful, it often overrides weak or inconsistent religious instruction. Many parents do not realize the extent of this influence until it is too late. A child who spends hours each day absorbing secular ideology through digital media is not neutral. That child is being shaped, imagination is being trained, desires are being directed, perception of reality is being conditioned. And once those interior frameworks are established, simple correction is no longer enough. Deep formation must be rebuilt, and that takes time, consistency, and spiritual intentionality. This is why the modern crisis in families is not primarily about external rebellion. It is about interior disintegration. Many children are not consciously rejecting the faith they were never deeply given. They are drifting away from something they only partially received. The absence of structured prayer, doctrinal teaching, sacramental understanding, and lived example leaves a vacuum that culture eagerly fills. One of the most serious symptoms of this crisis is the loss of spiritual authority within the home. Authority is not domination. It is responsibility ordered toward the good of others. When properly exercised, it creates stability, clarity, and peace. When absent or inconsistent, confusion takes its place. Children naturally look for guidance. If it is not provided within the family, they will seek it elsewhere, often from peers or digital environments that lack moral grounding. The erosion of paternal authority has been especially damaging. Many fathers have been conditioned to believe that spiritual leadership is optional or secondary to emotional support. But in Catholic tradition, the father is called to be a protector not only of physical well-being, but of spiritual integrity. This does not require perfection. It requires presence, consistency, and humility. A father who prays, who seeks confession, who strives to live according to truth, establishes a moral framework that anchors the entire household. At the same time, the role of mothers in transmitting faith cannot be overstated. Throughout the history of the Church, countless saints have credited their mothers with forming the foundation of their spiritual life. A mother's influence is often quiet but deeply persistent. Through daily habits, gentle correction, and constant prayer, she shapes the emotional and spiritual atmosphere in which children grow. When both father and mother are aligned in faith, the home becomes a place of formation rather than fragmentation. But when that unity is weakened, children often experience contradiction. One parent may emphasize faith while the other is indifferent. One may encourage prayer while the other prioritizes secular success above all else. This inconsistency creates internal tension. Children interpret contradiction not through theological reasoning, but through emotional coherence. And when the emotional message of the world is louder and more consistent than the message of the home, the world often wins. This is why intentional Catholic family life requires deliberate structure. Prayer cannot be occasional, it must be habitual. The Rosary, even if imperfectly prayed, creates rhythm. Shared meals, when approached with presence rather than distraction, create unity. Conversations about faith, even simple ones, reinforce truth in daily life. The sacraments must be central, not peripheral. Sunday cannot be treated as an isolated event, disconnected from the rest of the week. It must be the source from which the entire week flows. Another critical dimension is suffering. Modern families often attempt to eliminate all forms of discomfort from children's lives. While this intention is understandable, it can unintentionally weaken spiritual resilience. Children who are never asked to endure difficulty, delay gratification, or accept limitation struggle later in life when unavoidable suffering appears. Catholic tradition has always understood that discipline and sacrifice are not punishments but formations. They prepare the soul to remain stable under pressure. The same principle applies to emotional life. Modern culture encourages constant expression of feelings without discernment. But not every emotion requires immediate action. Not every impulse deserves validation. Part of mature formation is learning to recognize emotions without being ruled by them. This is particularly important in spiritual life, where feelings often fluctuate while truth remains constant. Prayer teaches this stability. It forms interior silence where God can be heard beyond emotional noise. The weakening of the family has also made children more vulnerable to ideological capture. Without a strong interior foundation, they become more susceptible to external narratives that offer identity, belonging, and purpose. These narratives often present themselves as compassionate or enlightened, but they frequently detach the individual from transcendent truth. Once identity is grounded entirely in external categories rather than in God, instability follows because those categories constantly shift. In contrast, a Catholic understanding of identity is stable because it is rooted in something unchanging. A person is created by God, loved by God, called by God, and ordered toward eternal communion with God. This identity does not depend on cultural approval or ideological alignment. It remains constant even when external circumstances change. That stability is essential for psychological and spiritual health. The restoration of the family, therefore, is not merely a social goal. It is a spiritual necessity. Without strong families, the transmission of faith weakens dramatically. Without transmission of faith, sacramental life diminishes. Without sacramental life, grace becomes less accessible. And when grace is absent, the soul becomes increasingly vulnerable to deception, despair, and disorder. But even here, the situation is not without hope. The same God who instituted the family continues to offer grace for its restoration. Small acts of fidelity matter more than they appear. A parent who begins praying again after years of neglect is not doing something insignificant. A family that begins praying the Rosary together, even imperfectly, is not engaging in a symbolic gesture. They are reestablishing spiritual order in their home. History shows repeatedly that renewal in the Church often begins in small domestic settings rather than institutional structures. Saints are formed in families before they transform the world. And even in times of widespread confusion, God preserves faithful households that become seeds of renewal for future generations. The restoration of what has been weakened does not begin with grand solutions or distant reforms. It begins where every real spiritual renewal has always begun, with the individual soul turning back toward God in clarity, humility, and obedience. History shows that when the Church has passed through crisis, it was never abstract ideas alone that renewed her life, but concrete acts of conversion lived quietly by ordinary people who chose truth over confusion. The first step is the recovery of sacramental seriousness. Confession is not a symbolic practice or a therapeutic exercise. It is the real encounter with divine mercy that restores the soul to grace. A Catholic who returns to confession with sincerity is not simply feeling better, but being reordered interiorly toward God. This is the foundation of all spiritual stability because no amount of intellectual clarity can replace a soul that remains bound by unrepented sin. The second step is the recentering of the Eucharist. The Mass is not one activity among many in Catholic life. It is the axis around which everything else must revolve. When the Eucharist is approached with faith, reverence, and awareness of what it truly is, it reshapes the entire moral and spiritual vision of a person. It becomes impossible to live casually when one truly believes they are standing before the living God. The third step is discipline in prayer. Not emotional prayer, not occasional prayer, but structured, faithful, daily prayer. Consistent silence before God, scripture read slowly and attentively. These are not optional devotions, but formative disciplines. They rebuild the interior capacity to perceive reality as it is, rather than as the world insists it is. Prayer is where clarity is restored when confusion has taken hold. The fourth step is the purification of influence. What enters the mind does not remain neutral. Images, ideas, and narratives shape desire over time. A Catholic seeking renewal must begin discerning what they consume intellectually and spiritually. This is not about fear or isolation, but about protecting the conditions in which grace can grow without constant contradiction. The fifth step is rebuilding faithful community. No one is meant to remain isolated in the spiritual life. The Church is not an individual project, but a body. Surrounding oneself with faithful Catholics, even a small number, creates accountability, encouragement, and stability. In times of confusion, community becomes a safeguard against drifting into error or discouragement. All of this, however, rests on one essential truth. Renewal is not primarily a human achievement. It is the result of cooperating with grace. God is not absent from times of crisis. In fact, history suggests he often works most powerfully when human confidence collapses, so that what remains cannot be attributed to human strength alone. The temptation in every age of crisis is to believe that darkness has the final word. But the Christian faith has never accepted that conclusion. The cross itself appeared to be defeat, yet became the moment of ultimate victory. In the same way, what looks like collapse can become purification, and what feels like loss can become the beginning of restoration. What is required now is not panic, but fidelity. Not noise, but clarity. Not despair, but perseverance in what has always been true. The Church has survived every age of internal confusion because her foundation is not human stability, but divine promise. And that promise has never failed. So the response is simple, but not easy. Return to grace, remain in truth, and live as though God is real in every detail of life, because He is.